Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So, I want to briefly talk about OJ's supposed confession. He did an interview with Fox years ago, and that interview has recently surfaced, and you have a lot of news networks talking about it, including CNN and CBS. I will include links to the stories involving CNN and CBS where they cover this interview and they talk about it so that you can watch those for yourself. But this whole thing raises very serious questions. And I'm going to start off by providing a summary of some of the key points from the interview. First of all, the whole purpose of the interview was to promote OJ's book entitled If I Did It, where he's basically talking about if he killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, this is how it would have occurred. And so he's on this show talking about how he killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. He claims that he's speaking hypothetically. Throughout the interview, they talk about how it's hypothetical. But despite that, when he's talking about the events, he uses the word, when he's talking about the events, he uses the words I throughout the interview. He's saying I this, I that, and that's very disturbing and it's very telling to me. Now, he is laughing throughout this interview. Which is sick. Here you are talking about the death of the mother of your children, and you're laughing throughout the interview. You're talking about the brutal death of a woman who was lying in a pool of blood, with her throat slit and all that stuff, and another man lying in a pool of blood. But throughout this interview, you're laughing. That doesn't make any kind of sense to me. That doesn't sound like or look like the behavior of somebody innocent. First of all, well, before I get into that, let me just go into what he said. So, in this interview, he talks about how he saw them, and he said this at one point, Nicole Brown Simpson falls to the ground, and then he says that this other man gave him a knife, and he says that Ron Goldman approached him like in a karate type posture, like he was ready to fight. And then, he grabbed the knife, and then from then on, he doesn't remember anything. He blacked out. Basically, he doesn't remember what happened. Um, and then, while he's saying this, like he starts laughing and saying, "Of course, I'm speaking hypothetically," and this and that. So again, I think that it's odd that someone who professed to be innocent would be talking about if they committed a crime, that they would be talking hypothetically about killing somebody. That sounds ridiculous to me. It doesn't make any sense for an innocent person to be talking that way. It doesn't make any kind of sense for an innocent person to have such a callous attitude when it comes to the death of his ex-wife, the mother of his children, and this other person. That doesn't seem like the conduct of an innocent person. And for him to use the words I, it sounds like he was in fact confessing during segments of that interview. That's what it sounds like. And, this has caused me to just reflect on a lot of things. Like, first of all, why would an innocent person actually put out a book called If I Did It? Now, his attorney claims that, it was for money. He had an opportunity to make a lot of money with this interview and with this book and all that kind of stuff. That's what it came down to. His attorney also claims that the interviewer was directing the questions and all that kind of stuff. But it's OJ who's basically describing events that he says occurred, or, he speculates or he talks about hypothetically. He's the one providing that narrative. Nobody's saying, well, egging him on or telling him to say this or say that. He's talking about this. He's describing these events. So I don't buy the story that this news reporter basically led the conversation. I don't buy that. And, I think that some things are obviously more important than money. Some things are definitely more important than money. What about the loved ones who lost their family members, who lost Nicole Brown Simpson or Ron Goldman? What about how they feel about the situation? Do you not care about how those people felt about it? Is money more important than people's feelings and, their well-being? Is money more important than the memory of your ex-wife? So I found that to be very disturbing, to say the least. I just can't understand what kind of person would put money over you know the memory of their ex-wife, and you know and over the feelings of these people who lost their loved ones. Also, there are a couple of things that you need to talk about in this issue, and that's the relationship between the police and the black community. The poor relationship between the black community and the police is part of the reason why you had a verdict like this. If the police did not have this history of racism, if they didn't have this history of police brutality and police corruption, I don't think you would have had this verdict in this case. You have to understand that this case took place after the LA riots. A situation where people were rioting because there was no justice in the Rodney King case. You had this brother, Rodney King, captured on videotape by the police, being brutally beaten by the police. They had billy clubs. A whole gang of police were beating this brother nearly to death. And it was all captured on video, and there was no justice. And, the court and the jury found those brutal pigs not guilty. And because of that, the people were outraged. Because of that, people were rebelling in the streets of LA. And you have to look at that backdrop as you look at this O.J. Simpson case. And then you have this officer, Mark Furman, who lied about not using the N-word. It turns out he's a notorious racist, a notorious bigot, someone who repeatedly used the N-word, who talked about, engaging in all kinds of police misconduct on tape. He's on tape saying these things. And when you add that to that backdrop that I talked about with the police and the police brutality and corruption, all of that made it possible for OJ to get off. The fact that this cop who found the glove is a notorious racist, that made it possible for this guy to get off. And I think that if I had to say whether or not OJ did it, I think more likely than not he did, in fact, commit these crimes. But in the criminal court, that's not the standard. The standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. And given the facts of the particular case, I think that there was reasonable doubt. And I understand why the jury reached their verdict. But now that you have this confession out here, well, it's basically a confession, whether OJ wants to acknowledge it or not. That's what it sounds like. Now that you had a confession out here, it's nothing that can be done because of double jeopardy. OJ can get on a TV show and literally say, yeah, I killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, and I enjoyed it. He could say something like crazy like that, and there would be no recourse. There's already a civil judgment against him, and the families haven't been able to collect on that. He was found not guilty by a court of his peers and all that kind of stuff. So he's not going to be retried for the criminal case. So it's just a horrible situation, man. And society has to look at itself, man, for creating a police department or policing system that is racist, that is brutal towards black people. Because when you have such a system, the trust between the police and the community is completely eroded. Law enforcement is undermined because of that. And this is a prime example of how law enforcement is undermined when it doesn't build a relationship with the community, when it is brutal towards the community, when it harasses the community, when you have corruption in the police department. This is what happens. I mean, we all know about Ramparts, and we've seen the film Training Day, and unfortunately, that's real life stuff that happens in the police departments. That level of corruption. Like here in Baltimore, you had these officers who were basically operating as a gang, sticking people up. So it's no wonder the people don't trust the police, and society just has to realize that they have to rebuild the relationship between the police and the community, because if they fail to do so, then you will have situations like this OJ verdict. And you will have situations where criminals are able to reign terror in the black community, and they're not being reported and all that kind of stuff, and not being captured and all that kind of stuff because of this erosion of trust between the police and the community. And this, I have to touch on one last point before I go, and that's, this whole issue of race baiting. You know, and there were real elements of race in this case. Obviously, you can tell by the reaction of the verdict. You had black people cheering this verdict, and you had white people, upset about the verdict. And I remember it clearly. I remember I was in law school at the time, not to date myself, but people were the black students were happy with the verdict, and the white students were like in shock and disbelief. And so there was a racial dynamic to this case. And the fact that you had this lawyer, Johnny Cochran, really manipulate that situation, it's a prime example of what race baiting looks like. That's what it is. Even though there are justifiable reasons why you would raise race in this case, but I just think it's an example. You could use this for an example of the higher narrative of race baiting and playing the race card, and how, unfortunately, when people do that, that can undermine real justice. And at the time, I think the jury did the right thing with the information that they had at the time, but they were manipulated. If you look at that the Fox show where they actually had the it was called The People versus O.J. Simpson. you know Throughout that show, that docudrama, they basically showed how the lawyers were able to manipulate the jury into believing that OJ is some black victim of police corruption and all that kind of stuff. They showed like how they changed up his house. Like his house had all these photographs with him with all these white people and no black people, and they changed it to have African art and civil rights photographs and all that stuff, playing into the race card, man, playing into race baiting and stuff, playing that up. And you have a lot of people that do this, like you have people who are caught up in corruption scandals, and they try to make it into some conspiracy of the evil white man to take down a black man and all that kind of stuff. So, this is a cautionary tale on so many levels. But tell me what y'all think about OJ's confession, man. I want to hear from the people. So with that, please rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace.